When it comes to selecting a trigger for your AR-15, it can be a little bit daunting making a decision because there are just so many trigger options out there. And at the end of the day, when it comes down to selecting a trigger, it is a lot more shooter's preference and what you personally want out of a trigger versus, you know, one trigger is better for this situation versus this trigger is better for another. There is some degree in play in there. So like if you have a precision gun, maybe you want a super crisp single stage trigger, but also there are people who generally just prefer two-stage triggers across the board, and I happen to be one of those people. However, good two-stage triggers are rare to come by and they're often very, very expensive. So the most common one you're gonna see on the market is the Geissele. They are about 240 bucks when they're priced normally, and that is a pretty hefty price for a trigger. Now, if you watched any of the videos we've made in the past, you will understand that I love Geissele triggers. I think they're worth every penny that they sell for because of their consistency. You know exactly what you're gonna get no matter what when you buy a Geissele two-stage trigger. They do come in curved, flat, and they also come in 2 different poundages. But all that to say, Geissele triggers are awesome, but they are very expensive. So we wanted to offer another really good two-stage trigger option that was at a better and more reasonable price, and enter in the Schmid two-stage trigger. So this trigger is a two-stage trigger, just like I mentioned. The weightage on this is 2.5 pounds-ish to the initial wall. So you're gonna pull some slack to a wall, and then it'll be another about 2-pound break from there. So it'll take another 2 pounds of force to break the trigger, releasing the hammer, and then that will discharge the firearm. So in comparison to a Geissele trigger, the Geissele ssa-e, the most common two-stage Geissele trigger out there, it's the same poundage as that trigger. But when it comes down to poundage of triggers, I like to actually go off of the feel of the trigger versus what is advertised, because there's always some tolerance, some different tolerances between triggers that are produced. So sometimes you get an ssa trigger that can be up to a pound lighter, and sometimes you can get a trigger that's a little bit heavier. So before we get into kind of demonstrating the feel of the trigger, I'm gonna try and demonstrate as best I can. I do wanna talk about the testing that we did on these triggers. So Schmid does offer this trigger in multiple coatings and multiple different trigger faces. They offer this in curved, they also offer it in a straight trigger face. They offer it in DLC, nickel boron, and then also phosphate. We're offering just the curved phosphate trigger at this time. We may add additional triggers in the future, but as of right now, this is the one that I tested the most and the one I'm most comfortable recommending. So I tested the nickel boron triggers extensively before the phosphate triggers came out, and I had some kind of issues with it. It was kind of sticky over time. As carbon built up, the trigger became very inconsistent and sometimes just would not function. I have not tested the DLC trigger at all as of the making of this video, but the phosphate triggers, I have multiple of them and they are fantastic triggers. So I do want to show a couple of the guns that they've been tested in, because you guys have seen these guns in content before. So first and foremost, we have this little Mark 18 here. It has the curved flat face trigger in it, or the curved phosphate trigger in it. This trigger has well over 10,000 rounds on it. It was tested in my T.REX rifle before this, and it ended up going to this gun because I like the trigger so much. I actually took a Geissele out of this gun for this trigger. The next gun you may be familiar with, we did a main channel YouTube video on and an armory channel YouTube video on this gun. This is the budget AR, so $750 gun. And this has the flat face trigger in it. So this trigger actually came to us as a prototype. It's extremely, extremely good. We're still testing this guy, so we may add this one in the future, but as of right now, not quite yet. It is very, very light, and I'll demonstrate how it feels compared to a Geissele here in a minute. So all that to say, this trigger has been tested. It's actually my personal favorite trigger right now. I do prefer it over Geissele's because of the feel of the trigger. So as I mentioned, the poundage of this trigger is the same to the Geissele ssa-e, which was my previous favorite trigger, but the feel of this trigger is a little bit different. The take up of the trigger is much shorter, and the break isn't as crisp as the Geissele. It has a slight roll to the break, so they may sound like a bad thing, but in my opinion, that's actually a pretty good thing. So I can shoot this trigger extremely fast, much faster than the Geissele because of that rolling break, but it also has that two-stage feel to it. So if I do want to take longer distance shots, I have that nice steady wall that I can pull back to, and then the trigger's only 2 pounds from there to break. So all to say, I really like this trigger. Now, what comes in the bag is pretty simple. You're just gonna get a small baggie like this with the trigger in it. You're going to have the trigger shoe with the disconnect attached to it. Basically, this trigger is gonna come pre-assembled for you, obviously not in your gun, but all of the pieces are together, so you don't have to try and figure out how they should be oriented or in which direction you should put the springs. So the trigger pins will already be in the trigger, both on the hammer and the trigger shoe itself. Now, before I demonstrate how to install this, let's try and demonstrate the feel of the trigger. So for the Geissele ssa-e trigger, we have that much creep into the wall, so pretty distinct wall. This is a nice smooth pull to the wall, and then when I try to break the trigger, apply pressure, it breaks. And as you can see, hopefully you guys can tell, there is no creep on the break of the trigger. So it breaks like glass, as some people would say. And it's very consistent. Now for the Schmid trigger, it's going to be pretty similar, but as you can see, the take up is much shorter. So I hit that wall and I continue to apply pressure, a little bit of a rolling break, but it's still very crisp. The reset is extremely short too, and that helps with shooting the trigger very, very fast. So you guys might be able to see on the camera, so just one more time, I pull the trigger back to the wall, a little bit of a roll, and then the trigger breaks, but it's still very, very crisp and definitely a very noticeable two-stage trigger. So here we go with the install of the trigger. So the first thing we're going to want to do is just take the pins out of the trigger. So like I said, they're already in the trigger. With the trigger shoe itself, the pin will come out pretty easy. You just push down on the disconnect a little bit to relieve some of the tension, and that spring or that pin will come right out. The hammer, however, is going to be a little bit tighter, so I just recommend taking a small hammer like this and just giving it a little tap while you hold it, and it will then come right out. So if you watched our lower parts kit product video or some other videos I have on the Armory channel, we do a complete demonstration of how to build out lowers, but I'll demonstrate the trigger here as well. It's just not going to be as good of quality as those other videos, so if you need additional assistance, check out our lower parts kit product video. So for the trigger removal process, if you have a bad lever, recommend you take it off first, but you don't have to. I'm not going to. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to release the hammer of the trigger. Make sure you ride the trigger hammer forward so you don't crack your lower receiver or the bolt catch. And then I'm just going to take this punch, some sort of punch, it doesn't really matter. And you should be able to just push this on through with the punch. You shouldn't need to use a hammer, but if your trigger's new, you may have to tap it. And then from there, once it's punched all the way through, I'm gonna leave that pin in there just like this, because if I just rip this out, the hammer's gonna go flying. So just wanna have positive control of the hammer as I pull the punch out, and then it's good to go. Now for the trigger shoe and the disconnect, same thing. This guy should just punch on through, and same thing, the disconnect inside. If I just yank this pin out, this disconnect will fly out. So I'm just gonna push down on it, keep control of it, and you're good to go. Now some triggers will not come out unless you remove the safety. So what you'll have to do is take the pistol grip off, the safety detent and the spring will just fall out, and then your safety will fall out, and then you'll have to take the trigger out. So that's just some fire controls. It's not all of them, it's actually a minority of them, but also there's some safeties out there that will require you to remove the safety in order for you to put a trigger in. But our Schmid two-stage safety, our Schmid safety is not one of those. Now from here, this is pretty simple. I'm just going to drop the trigger shoe, so the bottom portion of the trigger, into the lower. Make sure it goes under the safety itself. And then I'm basically just going to be holding this up to some light so I can see through the hole of the lower receiver. And I'm going to use one of the trigger pins, it actually doesn't matter which one, and push it on through. But I just have to kind of line things up as I do this. So you can do this by feel, or you can look as you do it. But generally what people get stuck on is about right here, where the trigger pin's kind of sticking halfway out. And that is because the disconnect is now in the way. So if you get to the point where this thing just won't go, what I like to do is just apply pressure down on the disconnect and then ride it back and forth just like that. And eventually it'll work its way through. Now this part can be a little tricky for some people, but this is actually a pretty simple install. So as you can see, I don't have any crazy tools or a vise or anything like that. I'm demonstrating this with just my fingers and a simple punch. So what I like to do is, if you have the rest of your lower built, that will help you with this method quite a bit. So I'm just gonna keep the stock under my arm. I'm gonna put the trigger hammer springs down on top, and the orientations are gonna go. But as you can see, there is a lot of tension here. This is a very strong spring. So what I wanna do is, I'm going to push down on the spring with my thumb and peel the hammer on back to the disconnect, and it will lock in place. So it's not gonna go anywhere as it sits right now. So what I like to do from here is I just keep my thumb over it just in case it gets bumped, because it will fly out. And from here, it's gonna be pretty close to lined up. So I should just be able to push this on through, pretty simple, just like that, and the trigger is now installed. So now we'll go ahead and function check it. And a function check is pretty simple, just keep my thumb on the hammer, make sure I can feel that wall, just, for that good feel. Trigger breaks, I'm gonna keep the trigger pin backed, reset the hammer, make sure I get that good reset click, and you're good to go. And then from here, I'm gonna put the weapon on safe, keep my thumb over the hammer just in case the safety's not working, and I'm gonna try and get the trigger to break on safe, and obviously it shouldn't. So there we have it. The trigger's installed, safety works, and we're good to go. Appreciate you guys watching. Hope this video was helpful for you guys, but if you guys have any additional questions about this trigger, just questions about helping to choose what trigger is right for you, if you need help with installing the trigger, really any questions about anything at all, shoot us an email at team@trex.com.